Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for a discussion of the top 10 most common CMMC gaps that we see as we're dealing with our clients and prospects. It should be an engaging time today, hearing from one of cybersecurity's top experts in this area, Bob Thomas. He is a virtual CIO, virtual CISO for our clients and works through these types of challenges with organizations every day. So with that, I will hand over to Bob and look forward to your questions. You can post them in the chat and we'll bring them into Bob to be able to handle along the way if appropriate or at the end if there's time. Bob?
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Mike. I appreciate the intro and thanks very much all for joining us today. As Mike was mentioning, I wear a few hats here at cybersecurity. Virtual CIO, so Chief Information Officer for our clients, helping them with budgeting, planning, and technology management. I am a certified information security manager, so I've got background in order to handle policy and procedure based tasks and understanding. And I am also a virtual CISO, security officer, both in-house, but also for our clients and prospects. And today we're going to talk about CMMC and what we see out there as we're doing assessments. Excellent. So it probably makes a little sense to go through CMMC from a high level, just so everybody understands exactly what it is and who it applies to. So the cybersecurity maturity model certification is for folks that deal in the defense industrial base. So if you've got clients that are underneath the DoD umbrella, handling can be very simple procurement. So what folks will see in a few minutes are federal contract information exchange clients. So they're getting contracts, but it could be for non-military use. So they probably don't require as sophisticated a security system, all the way up to people that are making and shipping missiles and guidance systems and encryption systems. So the CMMC is the next, I would call it, evolution of security and security compliance from the DoD. Just to give you a little background, the DoD created this and then created a governing body called the accrediting body, CMMC-AB, and they've evolved this from version 1 to version 2 based on some, I'll say, recommendations, requests, and some feedback from folks that work in the defense industrial base. Next slide. I think what people really want to know is, how it applies to them. Why, as this slide says, why should I care about CMMC? And what we've seen real world, both from its predecessor, what a lot of people call DFARS or 800-171 procurement, through CMMC version 1 and now version 2, is the DoD is trying to make sure that any plan data is really what they're concerned with. The creation of a helicopter, of a missile system, of guidance and secure communication systems, those types of things. Well, how are you protecting that data when it's in your hands and you're manufacturing a component or subcomponent? So the DoD says, you need to know where your data is, where you're getting it from, who you're sharing it with, all of these types of things. Now they're trying to make sure that you're doing it in a secure manner. And only folks that are compliant with CMMC are going to be able to bid and, more importantly, be awarded projects. I guess the way it really works is you can bid all the projects you want, but if you don't have the accreditation, you won't be able to be awarded. It's just that's how they're securing the information, and that's how strict they're being when it comes to your eligibility. Next slide. So I'm not going to go back and talk about version 1.0. I think it makes a lot more sense just to show what the baseline is today for the 2.0 version of CMMC. One thing that everyone should know is this goes into effect and with enforcement starting July of 2023. So people that are listening to this message today, this is a good time to get your arms around it, get an understanding of which controls you have in place and which you do not have in place. And with respect to controls, you can see the second column here next to levels 1, 2, and 3. Those are the numbers, the volume of controls that each level has as a requirement. So if you look at level 1, for folks that are in this field, FCI, you probably realize it's federal contract information. That does not touch CUI. So there is no controlled unclassified information being exchanged, created at level 1. Now, when they describe it as quote unquote foundational, that means you have a repeatable process for doing something, making something, securing something. There isn't necessarily a policy written about it, but it is a procedure that you follow to do something. There are obviously 17 what they call practices. Back in version 1, they called them controls. I will say same difference, at least for this discussion. But it is a very short list of adherences that you have to have in place in order to meet that guideline, that compliance level. Level 2, the numbers should look very familiar. The 110 practices, that equates very closely to what used to be called level 3, in the previous version where there were 5 levels. So they've tried to boil this down. They've tried to make it simpler. I'll explain a couple of other things shortly about why it's important to understand why this has evolved from version 1 to version 2. But I would say that 80% of the folks out there that are dealing with information from the DoD within the defense industrial base are going to land in the level 2 space, mostly because they are dealing with CUI. Level 3, there are very, very few companies that apply to. I mean, this is the prime contractors out there. Sikorsky, anybody under the ExoStar umbrella would probably fall into this category. GE, Northrop Grumman, that level, Electric Boat for folks here in Connecticut, that's really the prime contractors that have to have that quote unquote expert level. And one of the things that is really worth mentioning here is at the base foundational level 1, it is, I'll call it an honor-based system. It requires an assessment, but it is truly a self-assessment that is done each year that gets submitted to CMMC-AB for filing and pass, and basically checking the box to make sure that you are in compliance, but there's no audit. With the other 2 levels, 2 and 3, there is at least every 3 years an actual external audit being performed. This is an audit at your expense, and there is somebody coming in from the accredited board umbrella that says we're an auditing, attested and approved auditing firm, and they will come in and ask you for evidence, ask you what controls you have in place, and you'll need to prove it. And not just prove it once, but it will be repeated. Show us how you do it, show us the evidence, and then show us where you got the evidence, not just that, oh yeah, here's a piece of paper that shows we do it. Show me how you got that is really what's going to happen. Next slide. So what we put together here today are what we consider to be the top 10. This is the David Letterman of countdowns. What we're seeing out there as we're doing assessments, as we're finding gaps, creating gap lists and phases for remediation. And we're going to go through these. And I think these probably will be obvious once we go through it. But if there's questions, you should feel free to ask those. This one gets asked of everybody, and I can tell you I've probably seen 2 clients say yes to this. There's no documentation, and it does mean diagrams in this particular case to support data flow. So data flow, from the way we look at it, and I think this is really the way that the federal government looks at it, is how is information entering and exiting your systems and entering and exiting your facility. So this doesn't necessarily mean that it's electronic in nature. Sure, you could be getting secure FTP access to a server and downloading information. It could be sent via encrypted email. It could be delivered on encrypted drives or some matter of encrypted storage. There's plenty of ways you can get access to the information. That doesn't mean that someone's not walking in the door with a piece of paper that says, here's the plans for something that we need powder coated, and can you help us with this? Any manner of speaking, if there's plan data and descriptive data around either the federal contract or control on classified information, it is data that the government wants to know how it's being dealt with. How are you storing it? Who are you sharing it with? How are you protecting it? This is, it's very easy to answer this and say, oh yeah, we know, yeah, we get that data from ExoStar, GE sends us this way. It's good to know that, and it's nice to know it off the top of your head. The infamous, I get hit by a bus tomorrow, and who knows that? Who else has that in the top of their brain? It needs to be documented, and they're really concerned with how it's leaving your premise. We reprimanded a client because they are taking paperwork with every part that needs to be acted on by another subcontractor, and we find out that they're carrying paper, plan data paper with it and leaving it with the parts. Okay, who knows that is being treated appropriately? And we had to go through a session of changing their process when we found out that that's how they were handling it during an assessment. So I think that's important. I think this is overlooked, which is why it's quote unquote at the bottom of the list is number 10. But at the end of the day, it really helps to understand how data gets to you and what that data is comprised of and how you're protecting it. Next. The next couple are probably going to be really obvious, mostly because if you don't have an incident response plan in place, and again, having it on the top of your mind or having some notes jotted down does not really constitute a plan. What we're trying to instill in anybody that's on today's call is, if something happens, if there's a breach, if there's an outage, if there's something that requires response, that it's being done efficiently, timely, and orderly. I think those are the important things, so that, okay, this person, we found out about it, we acted on it, but that person fumbled around with it for 2 hours. Okay, that's not how it should happen. And I think everybody could appreciate that. They really want to see, okay, this person got assigned to it. There's oversight by a manager. Okay, 15 minutes have gone by. No, it doesn't look like he's going to find an answer to this. We need to escalate to somebody with more experience and better knowledge about the particular incident. It's that that defined, it's here, communication escalation times in our world. We want to know that somebody's acting on it, but not just sitting on it. And that people are in the know, that people that need information, that need access to a system that may be down because of a breach, that how long is it going to be down for? Give us an expectation. Who's working on it? What's next? Do we expect to lose any data? If we do, how are we going to recover from that? Are we going to have to restore from backup? What's it going to take to get the system back online? And those are the things that a written plan can afford you, as opposed to running around with your hair on fire. And the government does not want to see that as the response, because part of any scoring and assessment information and compliance information you're volunteering to the federal government, it's not just about cybersecurity. It's about your ability to deliver product. And if you have an outage and you can't deliver product for 14 days because it was that significant, they need to know that that's even a possibility, so that they can have alternative planning. They can have secondary supply chain available at the ready. So that's really why this is important. Yes, of course, it's important to get your systems and business back up and running and not lose clients and not put anybody else at risk. But I think it's really important to the federal government that the gears keep turning. Next slide. So similarly, there's the next slide is, I would say it probably goes hand in hand. A lot of folks consider a DR plan, disaster recovery plan, and an incident response plan to be the same thing. They're really not. I would say a DR plan is a subset or a component of an incident response plan, because incident could be any type of incident, could be mechanical, could be breach, could be weather related. There's a lot of reasons as to what could occur, but backup and disaster recovery is really all about systems and how am I going to get a failed system back up? What are my workarounds, if you will, while it's down? Do I have a system that is sophisticated enough to run my system that's down in a disaster, let's say business continuity capacity, while I'm trying to get my production system back up and running? Maybe, who knows? Maybe a power supply failed and took the entire system down. Maybe a RAID controller for controlling the drives and the storage failed, and it took the entire server down. I need a way to get back up and running in a temporary capacity while I fix, and at the same time, I need to get that either warranty or some sort of replacement part and repair done. Doing that in an efficient, organized, and methodical way is probably the most important thing. But you can't do all of that if you haven't tested your backups. You assume, oh yeah, we've put this backup system in, it seems to work fine, and then all of a sudden you rely on it and you need it. We went to restore and we found out there's nothing on the storage. What do you mean there's nothing on the storage? Well, we've been backing up every single day. We have the system in place. Well, it turns out that there was a drive failure in it, and it no longer has been backing up for we've seen these things. We go in and assess somebody's environment, hasn't had a backup in 5 months. That's disastrous and treacherous all at once. So testing backups, getting alerts when there's failures, getting notifications of successes, all of those things are important when it comes to having a backup solution in place and verifying it's actually functional. Next slide. This is an interesting one, and there is a tremendous amount of debate about this. So there's a bunch of folks out there, obviously, in the world that use Microsoft 365, and we're just really, at least for this discussion, we're going to focus on email. Obviously, there's a bunch of other components about it, but the first thing that people think about with 365, I think, is email messaging. We had a discussion yesterday. Client reached out to us. They asked us for a quote for GCC high. So that's the government level it's the highest government level of US-based storage and support for Office 365. It is now referred to as Microsoft 365. And the first question that I ask when I see someone that's a client or a prospect ask me about GCC level, I'm glad to see they know about it. That's great. I see GCC high, I immediately think iTunes. Are you covered under ITAR? Do you need to be ITAR compliant? Because those two things are on the same playing field. If you need to be ITAR, you need to have, if you're going to choose to use Microsoft, whether it be Azure servers or 365, you've got to be in their GCC high environment, which is a completely separate data center, completely separate from any of the corporate communications and corporate storage that they use. And it is supported only by US citizens. Your data doesn't leave the United States. It's not discussed by anyone or accessible by anyone other than US-based support groups. This is not offshored in any way. It's not, if you're not a US citizen, you can't be working in that data center. So those are important things to know. I said it, there's a lot of confusion about this. Depending on what level, we talked about CMMC level, what level of product you're making and contributing to will determine whether you can be in the corporate storage, which is really probably SCI only. I don't see how you can deal with control and classified information and be in a traditional data center. But there is regular GCC, and then there's GCC high. There are ways to use the traditional regular standard GCC if you are dealing with CUI but do not have ITAR clearance. That's a really important distinction. I know there's plenty of people out there that will just migrate their data to 365 corporate and say, oh, well, we'll just write a policy that says we're not going to store or communicate any CUI in there. That's not good enough. That does not pass the litmus test, and we've already run it by the accrediting board, and they denied that. And interestingly enough, you look at the risks that are associated with storing data in the cloud, and some people might say, well, I'll just keep an Exchange server on site. I can go along with that, but it presents a whole host of other risks and responsibilities and challenges, quite honestly. You've got to obviously stay very current. You've got to make sure patching is occurring on that Exchange server. We've had some dramatic Exchange exploits take place that we've had to patch very quickly for folks. Obviously, in the hosted environment, Microsoft takes care of all that. But from a breach standpoint, look at the numbers from Barracuda. So we use Barracuda as our email security platform, and they found that 29% of organizations that had their data in Microsoft 365 not have been suspected to be compromised or might have been or could have been compromised. That's a huge percentage of accounts. And I've heard numbers that are approaching 45 to 50% of actual domains have been breached at Microsoft 365 because they were never configured properly for secure access in the first place. So putting it in the right data center is important, and it has to pass that test, but having it misconfigured is even a bigger flaw and will create a much larger risk. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about backups and how you store them, where they get stored, because we've seen a lot of breaks in the compliancy with this when we do assessments. People will say, well, I've got a backup system and I'm writing out to external drive, and I'm putting them in my car and I'm taking them home at night, or I'm putting them in a safe, potential quote unquote fireproof safe. If it falls into the wrong hands and the data on that disk or whatever mechanism it is not encrypted, you might as well just leave it out in the road and somebody can walk away with it and get access to your data. That is your only first level protection against somebody getting access to all your data and being subject to significant fines. We're talking about $1 million fines. Somebody was just fined $1.1 million, and it wasn't even for backups. It was actually a laptop with unencrypted data falling into the wrong hands. So there's there's risk here. There's a couple of pieces that you should think about with not just encrypting the backups, but where they reside. If you are off-siting those backups, which quite honestly, everybody should. They should be off-siting them automatically, hands off, nobody has to touch it. But that transportation of the data, that backed up data from place to place, needs to be encrypted in transit. It's not just at rest in your building. And then wherever it's going to land, a data center, and it would have to be a stateside data center, would also have to be encrypted at rest in that location. And if it's getting copied to a second data center, very popular and quite honest, necessary when you're trying to protect the information at your core, should be encrypted at rest and in transit to and at that second location. So there's a lot of pieces to this. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it has to be considered and implemented. And I think making it more difficult for people to crack into the data that you're trying to protect is at the core of what's trying to be accomplished. It's financial records, it's planned data from the government, all of these pieces, personally identifiable information that's being stored and handled with care. Next slide. So I kind of referred to this in the last slide as well. So we're talking about backup storage. Well, now we're talking about live production storage. One of the first questions that any control assessment for the government is going to ask is your data, it's not spelled out the same exact way that you're going to see on screen here today. Is the data protected at rest? And a lot of folks would say, oh yeah, sure, I got a backup, I'm protected. It's on a server and I got 2 power supplies and RAID storage in there. Well, those are good things. I'm not going to throw cold water on them. Those are things that you need to have, should have. But at the end of the day, if the data is not being stored in an encrypted fashion, somebody could break into your building, take the server, walk away with it, change the password probably in 5 minutes or less once they've got their hands on it with a password cracker. And at that point, they've got full access to your data, unless it's encrypted. And now you start to think about, okay, are we only talking about servers, Bob? Well, we are talking about servers, but we're not only talking about servers. We're talking about any place where you've got sensitive information being stored. Is it on laptops? Are you accessing it remotely? And if you're accessing it remotely, are you actually pulling copies of it back to wherever you're located? Okay, now you're walking around with it on a laptop potentially. Is the laptop encrypted? Those are the questions you have to start to ask. Is it encrypted wherever its primary storage is, and then start working out from there to determine where is the data residing and is it protected in a fashion that if somebody were to get their hands on the physical equipment, do they have access to it? And a lot of what we're talking about is on-premise servers. All of what I'm talking about goes hand in hand with cloud-based servers. So if you're storing in Amazon, AWS, if you're storing at Microsoft with their Azure system, if you've got Google Cloud and their Google servers storing your information, or any other data center, have you enabled encryption on that storage? You talk about Microsoft. By default, they've got encrypted storage turned on. You have to actually do something to turn it off in their Azure environment. But does everybody do that? Do they have a process and a procedure for building? I think it's important to know that. Next slide. So, not everybody knows what advanced threat detection is, and certainly SOC monitoring isn't in everybody's back pocket, but SOC is Security Operations Center. We employ, full disclosure, a third party that is 24/7, 365 with their tool set to be able to collect data with something called a log shipper, where it's collecting logs from everything. When I mean everything, I really do mean everything. We're talking about switches, Wi-Fi access points, firewalls, routers, PCs, laptops, servers, any piece of infrastructure where there is data traversing it. They are collecting that information. We're passing it off to them. They're putting it into a data center. And they've got high-level security engineers looking at this information and correlating, trying to compare, hey, we saw this type of traffic come through the firewall and it looked a little suspicious, but wait a minute, we've got data moving and executable programs moving from this PC to this PC to this laptop, moving what we would call horizontally or laterally. That looks like a problem. Okay, we need to drop these machines off the network before we've got a full-scale crisis on our hands. And they're making those types of decisions and alerts instantly. They're also monitoring Microsoft 365 or G Suite to see, do we have somebody that's cracked in, gotten a username and password, and all of a sudden they're inside somebody's mailbox watching what's going on, creating forwarding rules to look at your mail while you're actually sending and receiving to try to intercept information of any sort. Doesn't even need to be planned data. It's just the ability to be able to see and act on exactly what you're communicating. So this advanced threat detection, a lot of people say, oh, that's just antivirus. It is absolutely not antivirus. This is a much more complex and full-featured function. We are catching things on the network that are happening and instantly responding to those. And by correlating events between different devices that are sending these logs to the data center for analysis, we're catching it faster and we're able to determine exactly how to, I'll say, undo it, to roll back and make sure that we haven't lost machines and data. Next slide. So this is a huge one. Yeah, we talk about ransomware a lot because it's in the press every day. People get hit with these every day. These are definitely not necessarily targeted events. So when somebody's information gets encrypted and you have no access to your data, or some subset of your data is you file open and it says that file's not recognized. That means the file's been encrypted usually, and somebody's asking for a ransom to be able to, quote unquote, unlock it and give you access back. The best protection about this at the end of the day is having good quality backups, because if you've gone through all the other protections and somebody's clicked something by mistake, and maybe even your staff have been educated about this, but at the end of the day, somebody's working quickly, not paying attention, they click something, and all of a sudden it kicks off a piece of malware and it starts encrypting files. What's your choice at that point? Pay the ransom or restore from backup? And quite honestly, paying the ransom in most cases is illegal because you're aiding and abetting a third-party country, and you're basically fulfilling their need to operate and need to perform by giving them money. So that is a no-no. What is really important when it comes to not just having your data backed up, but I think the really important part is, how do I make sure that my backups aren't going to be destroyed? And we've seen this with other providers where they had backups and we said, oh, the backup should be fine. And then they go to restore from backup, and don't you know that the backups are encrypted as well. So you need to have separation between your production systems and your backup systems, so that the term immutables here, the air gap is here. You need to have some sort of separation between production, file storage, where it's being backed up, and that there's no way for a particular piece of ransomware to run and target those backups and start ruining them as well. We use a technology that has complete separation on network, runs on two separate networks. Off network in data centers, there's separation between the data centers. Even if a group of files were corrupted, it is only taking that one point in time. It's not ruining every backup, because we're doing, typically 6 backups a day. If one of those gets trashed, we'll go right back to the one before it, wipe the files out, restore them, and depending on the amount of storage, seconds, minutes, if it's a huge amount of storage, hour or hours, completely back whole with all the files from the backup. So you have to think about exactly how you would get back up and running, what's involved, and what your loss is going to be. I think that's really something that until tragedy strikes, I'm not sure anybody really thinks about it. We talk to our clients about it every quarter in our business review meetings, but what can you stand to lose? You have to process these, because honestly, federal government wants to know too. How if you're down, how quickly can you get back up and running? As recovery time, recovery point. At what point in time will I be rolled back because my production system was compromised? I have to go back to backup. Oh, I haven't had a backup since Friday. Well, it's Monday afternoon. What's happened in between? Well, we don't take backups on weekends. Why not? So that, maybe you don't work on weekends. Maybe it's limited work on weekends. But you've lost all of Monday. You've lost all of anything that happened Saturday, Sunday, and whenever we may have been backed up on Friday. That's the time. So that recovery point, you're rolling all the way back to Friday and have to recreate everything in between. These are the things that I think are really important for people to understand when you have a ransomware incident or some other failure that you have to restore from. Next slide. This is kind of an interesting one, and I say that mostly because I was with somebody else from our team at a backup and recovery conference, and it's evolved to a lot more than that. And they had somebody from the FBI there, and his first item that he said everybody needs to be doing, should be doing, in order to, quote unquote, better protect themselves, they need to do patching. They need to be running operating systems that are supportable. And so that means supportable by the manufacturer. We'll use Microsoft as an example here. Windows XP, you can't be running that. And if you are, you can't be running it attached to your network and attached to the internet. It's got thousands of exposures that were never patched because it's no longer supported by Microsoft. Okay, let's fast forward. Maybe you've got rid of all the XP in your environment. Windows 7, same thing. Hundreds and hundreds of exploits have been found because that system has been unpatched, unprotected, and unsupported by Microsoft for it's over 2.5 years now. That's January of 2020, I believe. Yes, it's January 2020. They stopped supporting it and issuing any sort of patches to remediate issues that they found. Windows 8, people say, well, that's not that old. It's actually a lot older than you think. That's 7 years old now. And it was put into extended support, but the extended support only really applies to the 8.1 version. 8 is end of life and end of support and end of security patching. You could talk about servers, same thing, Windows 2000, Windows 2003, Windows 2008 server. All of those are end of life by years, 2000 by a decade, and no longer supported, no longer patched, easily exploitable by anybody that has any semblance of technique to hack. And you should probably be aware that 2012, a year from now, will be end of life and end of support as well. So if you're running those servers, you have to start thinking about planning to refresh get that operating system out of the environment. But all of this goes back to patching. As Microsoft finds issues, as issues are reported to them, you have to make sure that if you've got a supportable environment, Windows 10, Windows 11 are the ones that are out there primarily in the marketplace. We can talk about Mac, we can talk about Linux. There's ones that are supported on that end too. You've got to update them. And really the only way to do that is to have some sort of automated tool to be able to deliver it to every machine. You're not sitting running around machine to machine and clicking next, install updates. You will miss them. Machines won't get rebooted. When was the last time I did that? Oh, I forgot about that machine out on the shop floor in the corner. Must be months since I saw that thing. It's those types of events that leave a machine vulnerable to any attack by even the simplest of hackers once you've got an unpatched machines. Next slide, number 1. No multi-factor. So we talk about this every single day. If there is, and Mike, our president, has a comment that he makes to just about everybody we run into. If you're not going to do anything else, start with multi-factor. And this doesn't just mean multi-factor with Microsoft Office. We agree that that is mandatory, and I say Microsoft Office, it could be G Suite or Google Workspace now. Wherever you have the ability and the vendor has given you the capability of enabling multi-factor authentication, meaning, just like that cell phone is appearing there with 6-digit code, it could be, we use Cisco Duo here, where it sends through a push that says authorize, or do you agree that you just tried to log in, authorize the connection, click yes. There needs to be some protection, not just username and password. You've got to have some other method. And after the conference we were just at, a lot of people have thrown cold water even on the idea of this code system on a cell phone. They said, we think it's even more secure if you have a token, what they call a YUBI, Y-U-B-I, plugged into a machine, and that holds the keys to the kingdom. And yes, it's transportable. You can move it between machines, but without that key, you're not getting on. You can't get onto your email. You can't get onto the network. I think those things are really important. It's too easy to hack passwords if you've got the horsepower, and some people will never change their password. They will have, we've seen very limited password techniques. Somebody with a 5 or 6 character password, 5 or 6 character password, we're talking inside 10 minutes, a hacker can crack that level of password. Even if you get up to 8 characters, if it's not a complex password, we're talking a half an hour for the horsepower that they have to be employed to hack that level of password. So multi-factor will certainly increase the difficulty. It's not going to make it impossible for somebody to hack a system. There are sophisticated folks out there that can break through that as well. But at the end of the day, MFA is a very, very big deal, so that you've got some physical piece, something, whether it be a token, a YuBi key, a phone, something that is tied to your account, needs to authorize your access into the system that you're trying to gain. Those are the top 10 things that we're seeing out there. There are others, but those are the ones that will immediately stop you in CMMC compliance. Any of these are a non-starter if you don't have them in place. Now, there is something that we probably should take 1 minute and just let everybody know about with respect to CMMC and the evolution from 1.0 to 2.0. There is very similar to how NIST 800-171, and for you folks that are familiar with the SPRS scoring system, it's a risk scoring system for service providers for procurement. And when you went through those tests, and said, yep, here are the things that we have in place. And yes, we meet these criteria. And then you run into one that you don't. Okay, what do I do? Well, back in the 800-171 days, when that was all that was available, you'd say, I don't have this in place, but I have a remediation plan. And that remediation is planned for 3 months from now. And here's how I'm going to remediate it. That same type of function is now part of CMMC 2.0. This is no longer I meet the criteria or don't meet the criteria, meaning if you don't meet it, you were a failure, and that was it. You basically might as well have gotten a 0 on the test. Don't care about anything else that you were doing right. That's been, I'll say, remedied. It's been changed. So now what we're talking about is they're looking at weighting every item on the control list, on that 110 practice areas that we talked about on level 2. And if it is not a critical item, they are willing to accept a POAM, a plan of action for remediation. And how are you going to remediate it? Give us a timeline, and they will determine if that's satisfactory, if they're willing to accept that. So they're getting a little softer on the qualifications and the compliance, but you're still going to have to give them an assessment, give them details on gaps and how you're going to close those gaps. We have a process in-house that we follow and we've built, that's spelled out here on the screen. We go through a process of discovery. We have to understand someone's environment in order to assess it. We assess the environment, both physically and with Q&A sessions to understand exactly how people are developing product, how they're protecting it, what do they have for policies, what's the procedure, how we go through backup assessments. Do you have the plan? Show us the plan for recovery, all those things. After we're done with an assessment, we prepare a gap analysis. We've got 20 items. These 20 items are still not fulfilled. And then we're going to explain exactly what the importance of each item is. We're going to rank them, very similar to how we rank the top 10 today, from the most important in this case to the least important. Maybe it's based on difficulty. And then we're going to show you exactly how to remediate those and what the cost and the plan is. So remediation recommendations, then planning, and then the implementation. Sometimes it's our client doing the implementation. Sometimes it's us. Sometimes it's a combination of the two, but trying to get there quickly to not only get to the finish line, but get there in an efficient manner. And I think that's how we go about things with respect to a process from start to finish. And obviously the follow-on to all of this is if you're a level 2, it's going to have to be submission and then planning for auditing, etc. We've got a management plan to deal with that as well. Next slide.
Bob, before you go on to the special offer, I got a couple of questions in here, and I think we got a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to, some of these were similar, so I'm going to try to combine and paraphrase, and hopefully I get the intent of your question. But if I miss it along the way, please just drop something else into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll take a look. There was a few around the self-assessment, and in general, let's just say I did the self-assessment. I may not have known all the answers, so I answered in the affirmative that I was doing some things that may have been stretching the truth in some way. What do I do now if I realize that this stuff's really going to be checked up on? How do I right the ship there?
Okay, so I think the answer is we're not looking for somebody necessarily with authority from an audit level, but I think somebody with the knowledge. It's better if I give you an example. So that exact scenario was just done by one of our clients. They asked us to do an assessment. We did an assessment. We found a bunch of gaps, and they hadn't yet done an SPRS, which was necessary for them to start responding to contract requests and bid requests. And they showed us how the SPRS Q&A was responded to, how they answered it. They sent it to their IT person, and then they sent it to me. And I looked at it and I said, well, we now have a really good idea of what you have in your environment. I think we need to go through this and we need to help you, because I read the first 5 answers and 3 of them were wrong. And wrong, I know, is a strong word, but at the end of the day, we get a lot of questionnaires from a lot of different folks for a lot of different reasons. A lot of them cyber liability insurance related. We had somebody send us Q&A. There's 20 questions. I think at least 15 of them were wrong, the answers to them. And I'm not saying that, oh, it was kind of close. It's just blatantly the reverse of what was on there. So I think because there's teeth in this compliance and there's going to be auditing, I think it behooves you to try to get the correct answer. And most importantly, since there is this, I'll call it wiggle room, to be able to say, hey, we understand we've got a problem. We don't have the right level of patching in place, and we're still running Windows 7, instead of looking the other way. But our plan is within 6 months, there will be nothing less than Windows 10 or 11 in our environment. We've got a planned upgrade for that old server. I think it affords the opportunity with CMMC 2.0 to be able to be as truthful as possible and put your best foot forward and say, here, this is how we're going to answer the problems. We're not perfect. Trust me, 95% of them out there are ugly in some form or another. And if you're truthful and can explain the technology, whether it's you've got the background or you need assistance from someone, I think it's better to put your best foot forward and try to be honest and complete with the answers. Answering yes or no isn't really what they want. They want evidence. They want reality, especially when it comes to something on the negative side. If there is a gap, they want to know how you're going to close it.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers it, but I mean, that's what we've seen and that's our experience.
And I haven't seen any follow-ups to that pop up. So I'll go to one last question. It's around the process. It came in when you had the process slide up. And just in general, how long does it take to become CMMC compliant, in the organizations that you've seen?
Okay, that's funny because I'm looking at another copy of the slide deck on one of my other screens, and I had a note and I didn't read the note. So the typical numbers that we're seeing for getting from assessment through to compliance are 6 months to a year. Can it be done faster? I suppose. How much faster? Not very much. And of course, it all depends on a couple of things. And these are probably obvious, but at least worth mentioning. You've got to figure out where the gaps are. How can you figure out where the gaps are if you don't know where you are? You got to have an assessment done and understand where you stand. And then, obviously, at some point, it's going to come down to money. You're going to have to allocate and budget funds to employ new techniques, new tools, new safety and precautions. We met with somebody, their backup system is absolutely horrible. They have no idea if they're getting good backups. One of the machines is not getting backed up. We verified that. Okay, well, you need a new backup system. Okay, well, that costs X. It's monthly this because it has to be, need licensing, need replicated storage offsite storage costs, all these pieces, and you've got to get the time in to do it. So it's those things that will usually track it beyond 6 months. But I don't think you can really, just speaking of the process, I don't think you can do anything until you know where you stand. You've got to get a baseline.
That's great. Thank you. And that probably rolls you into the special offer. Do you want to present that, or do you want me to?
Go ahead, Mike. You're good at this.
So as part of a thank you for spending the time with us today, we are offering a free gap assessment of these 10 most common roadblocks. And it won't just be going through the 10 questions as much as discussing with you where you're at and the kinds of ways that you might be able to get further in your process with some remediation recommendations, et cetera. If you are interested in going through that process, Brandon, is there a URL for that you can throw into the chat everybody can see? Or should I just have them email us?
Have them email us, or I can email it with the slide deck afterwards.
Okay, so you can email us at marketing@cybersecure.com. That'll come in. I'm sorry?
It's on the next slide.
Which is on the next slide. Thank you.
Yes.
And those requests will come in. We'll get you set up for that gap assessment. And otherwise, Brandon is going to be following up with this slide deck, so you'll have this information to take a look at. Any subsequent questions or anything that you have, please feel free to shoot us an email. Thank you, Bob, for that thorough explanation of the top 10 gaps. And thank you, everyone, for spending the last hour with us. We hope that you have a great rest of your day and look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, everybody.